A second great solemnity in ordinary time is the solemnity of the body and blood of Christ, commonly called Corpus Christi, or the Body of Christ Sunday. And on this day, the Church commemorates the great gift of the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ that was given to us for the first time at the Last Supper, and then is given to us every time the Mass is celebrated throughout the world. So today's Gospel is going to be taken from the Gospel of Luke because it is year C. However, somewhat surprisingly, you might think, oh, well, Corpus Christi, we should look at the Last Supper. Church doesn't do that. It actually goes back to the public ministry of Jesus, and we look at the feeding of the 5,000, at Luke's account of that. So let's walk through that passage together. We'll unpack it, then we'll go back to the Old Testament, see how they relate to one another, and how all of this ties to the Eucharist, which Vatican II called the source and the summit of the Christian life. So Luke chapter 9, verse 11 through 17 says this. When the crowds learned it, they followed Jesus, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowd away to go into the village and the country round about, to lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a lonely place." But Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in companies, about 50 each." And they did so. And they made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and blessed, and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate, and were satisfied, and they took up what was left over, 12 baskets of broken pieces. Okay, so a few things. First, the feeding of the 5,000. You've heard this one before because it's the one miracle of Jesus that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all testify to this magnificent miracle that Jesus performs of feeding 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish. And in one of my other lectures on this video, I actually walked through how this is indeed a miracle. Not a miracle of sharing, it's a miracle of multiplication, especially in John's account, which makes very clear that the food that the people eat is derived from the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, right? That the 12 baskets that are filled up after, this is in John, come from those original elements. So I'm not going to go into that today, just suffice it to say here that no matter how tiny you break the pieces up into, you can't get enough bread and fish to feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless there is a miracle of multiplication. So that's what's taking place here. Another aspect you might notice as you're reading through is that in Luke's account, it's very similar to the other accounts. You've got the 5,000 people, you've got the 5 loaves and 2 fish. But there are some distinctive elements that are worth highlighting here. Number 1. First, Luke emphasizes that it takes place in a lonely place. Now that's the Revised Standard Version's translation. The Greek word there is actually eremos, which can also be translated as a deserted place, or it's actually just the word for a desert, meaning the wilderness. So for example, when Jesus goes out into the desert to be tempted by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights, the Greek word there is the same word, eremos, okay? So if you're a first century Jew and you're reading this account or you're hearing about Jesus doing this miracle in the eremos, in the desert or in the wilderness, it's going to echo or call to mind for you the wilderness wandering in the desert at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. So the setting of the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness is itself already your first clue that this miracle is pointing back to the Exodus from Egypt. And it doesn't take a biblical scholar to know that in the Exodus from Egypt, one of the great miracles was the miraculous feeding of the 12 tribes of Israel through the gift of the manna from heaven, of this miraculous bread from heaven. right? So what we have here in the feeding of 5,000, just the very setting itself, in a lonely place or in the desert, is an echo of the miracle of the manna, which, by the way, is another reason for showing that this isn't a miracle of sharing, right? Because the miracle of the manna in the Old Testament didn't have anything to do with sharing. It had to do with God miraculously and supernaturally supplying his people with food while they were in the wilderness so that they could journey to the promised land, right? So if the feed of 5,000 is a recapitulation of the manna, if Jesus is like a new Moses in a new wilderness feeding the new Israel, then it wouldn't make any sense for the first one to be miraculous, but this new and greater feeding to be a simple natural act of sharing. It's a preposterous suggestion. There's no biblical foundation for it in the text, and it just basically is groundless. It has no basis in the text or, frankly, in tradition too. It was made up about 150 years ago by a German rationalist who didn't believe in miracles. So he tried to come up with some other way to explain the text. Here, what we see is an echo of the Exodus from Egypt. A second element here has to do with something that is common to Luke and the other Gospels, namely the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Right? So there's a dramatic difference between the amount of food they have and the number of people that need to be fed. I mean, if you've ever given a party for 50 people at your house, you know how much food 50 people can eat. So this is 5,000 people, and all they have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. So it's going to take a miracle to feed them. Now, a third element of Luke's account that really is striking is the fact that Jesus makes them sit down in companies of about 50 each. That's something that I know for me, I blew right past years after years of reading the text. I never really noticed that. But if you pause and think about it for a second in real time, when the apostles asked Jesus, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And the apostles say, well, are we going to go buy food for them? Well, this is not possible. What does Jesus command them to do? He tells the 12, make them all sit down in companies of 50 each. Now, how long would that take? How long would that take the 12 disciples to get 5,000 people to sit down in companies of 50 each? I mean, as a professor, it's hard sometimes to get 35 people to sit down and be quiet so we can start the class, right? So, it can be difficult to bring a group to order and to make them all calm down and sit down, much less to arrange them in groups of 50 each. So why does Jesus do that? It's a little weird. Why doesn't he just, multiply the loaves and the fish like in the movies? He always does that in the movies. In the movies, they never show the apostles going around, okay, now 50 you here and 50 here. What's going on? Well, I'll never forget one day I was reading the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a famous Dead Sea Scroll called the Damascus Document. The Dead Sea Scrolls were these ancient Hebrew writings from the time of Jesus that describe the beliefs of a Jewish group, probably most likely identified as the Essenes. And one of the things the Damascus Document does is it's looking forward to the time of the Messiah as like a new Exodus, right? When a prophet will arise like Moses, and there'll be events that parallel the Exodus from Egypt. And in that document in chapter 12, it describes how in the time of the Messiah, the new Israel, the people of Israel, are going to sit down in companies of 50 and 100 and things like that. And I thought, oh, wow, it reminded me of the feeding of the 5,000, which brought me back to the book of Exodus. Because in the book of Exodus, chapter 18, this image of the 12 tribes being arranged into specific groups of 50 is actually a biblical image, right? So why does Jesus make the apostles do this thing that would have taken time and effort? Well, it's because he is arranging the people at the feeding of the 5,000 according to the same kind of groupings that you find in the first Exodus from Egypt. Listen to the words of Exodus chapter 18, verse 25 to 26. It says this: Moses chose able men out of all Israel, that means all 12 tribes, and made them the heads over the people, rulers of thousands, hundreds, and 50s and 10s. And those men judged the people at all times. It's Exodus 18, 25 to 26. So what Moses is describing here, it's not exact parallel with Jesus, but it's significant. It's Moses basically choosing what were called phylarchs, these men who would kind of rule over the different tribes and judge them. And they are divided up into thousands, hundreds, and 50s and 10s. Now that division of the people of 12 tribes of Israel underneath these 12 judges, these 12 filers, it's picked up. And in Jewish tradition, by the time you get to the 1st century, the idea of 12 judges organizing the people of Israel into different groups, the one that gets highlighted in the Dead Sea Scrolls is groups of 50, becomes a kind of image associated with the, so to speak, the hierarchy or the organizational structure of the Exodus from Egypt. So when Jesus does something similar with his apostles, he takes 12 men and appoints them to arrange the people, the 5,000 men, into groups of 50 each. It's kind of, actually, one scholar has pointed this out, it's kind of a military exercise as well, setting people up into divisions, so to speak, according to numerical units. What's he doing? He's implicitly revealing his identity as the new Moses. The 12 apostles are like the new 12 judges, and then the people, 5,000 people, are like a new Israel, okay? Because this is the new Exodus. He's revealing through the sign that the new Exodus is at hand.